Good evening, everyone. I'm Sherry Carmichael, and I welcome you tonight to our October the 9th program for the Powell-Liberty Historical Society. We're privileged to have as our speaker tonight Mr. Brent Carson, who is locally known as Mr. Delaware County History. And Brent is a lifelong resident of Delaware, having grown up on a dairy farm just 1 mile west of Delaware town. Brent graduated from Willis High School, I believe I have that right. And he went on for his college years at Heidelberg University. And in fact, his college, just this spring, he was honored with their Outstanding Alumni Award. Okay. He came right back to Delaware and served his community by teaching 6th grade for 31 years at Willis School. And was it Willis, wasn't it? Yes, okay. And there seems to be no one that he doesn't know, and no one who does not know and love him. He became involved with the Delaware County Historical Society in 1975 and has served on many committees. He provides speaking programs. He's a reenactor. He's led the society as president of the board of trustees, and he now holds the title of board emeritus. Upon his retiring in 2005, he says it was his desire to pursue even more activities with Delaware County history. And in fact, we're looking forward to a book, which he is writing at the moment, in the process of. He says this in a question that I asked him: our family always enjoyed sports. We had a lighted wiffle ball field in our barnyard, a lighted area for croquet in the front yard, and a lighted basketball court in the backyard. And in 1965, we opened a miniature golf course in our cow pasture, and we operated it for 30 years. With that background, I'm sure we will all enjoy his presentation tonight, which he has titled Battlefields and Arenas, Arenas, the Early Days of Sports in Delaware County, or Gymnasiums, Stadiums, and Ball Fields. Take your pick. Okay, it is with pleasure that I present to you Mr. Delaware County History, Brent Carson. Welcome, Brent.
Thank you. Thank you, Sherry. It's good to come down here to Powell. And regarding that golf course opening in our cow pasture, yes, we had some of our cows were the best golfers you could ever imagine. And we really taught them well anyway. But it's good to be here, and I am glad to be able to present this kind of a program. I really like your display here. And over the years, picked up a lot of stories about sports around this county. And so, in fact, in the book that I'm writing, I'll include a section on that as well. But yes, when I think back to sports in this county, I think back, first of all, being Ohio State football right now, and about that first game that was ever played up in Delaware when Ohio State came up to play because Ohio Wesleyan was restricted in going away to play. They were not allowed to play. They had in 1878 had a baseball team that traveled to Kenyon, and they were not permitted to go to Kenyon or anywhere else. No team was. And for that reason, for the next 12 years, they were not allowed to play any sports. That was restricted then. In 1890, during graduation, they thought, let's play a game against Ohio State. They've never played a game before. We've never really played a football game before. So let's invite them up here to play. And they came up in their horses and wagons, traveling up there along either 23 or around 315 there. and made their way to Delaware, coming early in the morning so that they could make sure they could get back by night, and played it in the spring in May. Played it along a creek there on the campus, and the ball kept going to the creek. And the fans were allowed to watch. Even the women were allowed to go and watch it. And that was almost a no-no back then, but they were allowed to sit on the hillside and watch that first game, which Ohio State won 20-14. And I think there was some comment made that they could have won that except for the ref. And some things never change, do they? You know, all these years, it's always the ref. But that was the very first game. But yes, in sports over there, now, for example, I got into basketball over there. The original idea in the university was that you were not supposed to play any sports. That was a no-no. They were very much in favor of physical education and physical building up your body and all that, but it was to take place inside of wherever it was they were living, or at the very most, stand right outside the door and do your calisthenics out there. Nothing else. No teams of any kind. Finally, when they started to get into teams, in fact, as early as 1860, they asked for a gym for the university. Of course, that got turned down immediately. And there was a big comment in the university. One of the newspapers early on was, we have a 23-acre campus and no place allowed to play any sport. And the students were not happy about that. The professor finally said, you can play in my backyard, which went way back there across from the fire station there in Delaware. So that's how things got started. Basketball, women, well, the men were prohibited from playing. Women not only could play, they had to play. That's part of your phys ed requirement. And so they were the women's college, they permitted women to play. In fact, they were on intramural teams playing in the old University Minette Hall down in the basement, and that was quite competitive. And then finally, in 1897, they allowed the women to come outside and play a game for the public outside behind there. That was the first basketball game in Delaware County's history where the public was allowed to go. So it was a women's game there at Ohio Wesleyan. All kind of things back in those early days of sports, though. Now, for example, and by the way, don't pay any attention to that date. That's the last time I gave this program. And so, and there may be some changes from all of that. But anyway, yeah, you go back into those early days of sports. For example, Ohio Wesleyan once was invited to play a game up in Mansfield, play a football game up there. Now, at that time, you could still put people in on your team who were not going to the university. Occasionally, you could put in somebody that way, and you'd play local teams instead of universities. I should probably stay in your range, shouldn't I? You're probably trying. There we go. Sorry about that. Brad Cowan back here, he's always warning me about that. And so I need to stay still, don't I, Brad? But anyway, the game up there they went to play. The reason they were allowed to play is because it was a city festival thing going on. Well, I'd call it a festival, but it really wasn't a festival. It was for a public hanging. They were to play the football game in the morning, and then in the afternoon they're going to have a public hanging. And so they thought they needed more activity than just the hanging. That was way back in the 1800s too. A little bit more about that early football at Ohio Wesleyan. They had a coach at Ohio Wesleyan very early on by the name of Sterling Yost. And he was a young guy, and again, the rule was that you could put somebody in sort of what they called the ringer, who was somebody who was not necessarily on the team, or they put the coach in. when they went to play Michigan. Michigan was supposed to have had a tremendous offense, so they put him in. And they got down to, they only took 13 people with them to play. And by the time they got rid of about 4 or 5 due to injuries, they had to put him in. It got down to that bad. And so he played the remainder of the game and held Michigan to a 0-0 tie. And later, they came back and decided, we need to get him up here. So they got Sterling Yost to go to Michigan, in which case he then played against Ohio Wesleyan in that game, and they beat Ohio Wesleyan. Sterling Yost, by the way, became the winningest coach in the history of Michigan football. And he's the one who opened the big house up there in Michigan. And and of course, Ohio Wesleyan was invited to be the opening game in the big house, as they were invited to be in the opening game at the Horseshoe. And, in fact, when they played in one of those early games, it might have been even the first game, Sterling Yost came down to watch the game, even though he was coaching for Michigan, not because he wanted to see Ohio Wesleyan, he wanted to scout Ohio State. He wanted to see how good they were. So he took his quarterback with him, and he and his quarterback watched the game. He thought that'd be more useful than going to their own game. So they took their quarterback and their coach down there. The coach went down there, and Michigan won anyway, and they got information about how Ohio State was. Okay, well, moving on. I want to get into here, though, more about high school and high school sports. Way back, when you talk about football, so many of the teams didn't have. In fact, here, I have this quote. This is the only thing I really wanted to read to you today, and that is this. I'll see if I can even do it without my reading glasses. This comes from Galena. I do have them. I probably ought to use them. Anyway, so, okay, here we go. This came from Galena. Galena, like Powell and other small schools, either they didn't have enough to play football, or in the case of Galena, they had probably enough, but it got to the point where they decided, this is in 1916, they decided that they didn't want to play football. And here's why. It said it in their yearbook. Football has never been played at Galena High School, only as a rough and tumble game. The fellow with the ball tries to get through the line by any method, and there is usually a great big quarrel. The best athletes do not like this way of play, so we don't try the game. We prefer basketball. And they said we had tried basketball in 1915. Everybody seemed to like it, so both the men and the women played basketball there. I ought to get into this because I'm standing here talking too long. So let's flip to our first. So when I say let's, I talk to myself a lot. Let's see here now. Let's, it's working good. This, talking about gyms around the county, and you think of, we have such a great country, and to think that when you think that there are more gyms, nice gyms, in Delaware County than well over half of the countries of the world, just in Delaware County. And you think of places like Liberty or Orange, Eldon-Tangi, and Liberty, and here we have, let's see here, we have the Braves, and I forget where we are over here, but a big one perhaps. When you get into football, there's There's Liberty High School. And you get into baseball, and you think of some of these. Oh, this is the girls' softball up in Delaware. I'm going to go way back to the beginning here, though, to mention that Delaware County begins in 1808, and by 1811, the city of Delaware, the village of Delaware, with less than 200 people in the whole village, felt that even though they're in this wilderness, with all the dangers and everything, they already set up a ball field back in that wilderness, right there in the center of Delaware. And it was just across from that BP station where that president was born, you know, where Hayes was born. From right about along in here, all the way down to the next block, between there and the creek, was a ball ground, they called it. Main thing was quoits. They also called it Old Cat. And I don't know how the Old Cat got, because quoits is where you threw an iron ring over a post. I don't know if they ever threw any cats, but that also was what it was called. And they also had, no doubt, other activities. But eventually they expanded it to a second field that went all the way to the river. So past where the St. Mary Church is in the city of Delaware. That was all ball ground reserved for a period of time. And yet, you know, with all the dangers and all, you wonder, their priority was still thinking about what do we do for entertainment in a community. And I think of this corner in Delaware, just down from Bud's Restaurant on the corner of the main corner of Sandusky and Winter. That building there, at one time, that was the area where they had a bowling green. In 1859, we found it in one of the directories. We don't know how many years before that had it been going on, but certainly in 1859, they had a bowling green in that area. There's Ohio Wesleyan's original field after they moved away from the creek area. And this is behind the old Edwards Gym. And there was that stadium connected actually almost to the gym itself. And then this man on the right at the top was a man by the name of Branch Rickey. He's the one, how many are familiar with Branch Rickey and the story of Jackie Robinson, and the first African American in sports? And that was in professional sports. And this man here in the center who became a doctor, a dentist in Arizona eventually, but he is the man who caused Branch Rickey to make that change, because he was not allowed to stay in a hotel when they went to play somewhere. And as a result, he always remembered that when he went up to the room, the only way he could stay in that hotel was if he would stay with Branch Rickey himself, the coach. And he talked him into letting him do that. And by the time Branch Rickey got to the room, this man was sitting at the end of the bed, crying and rubbing his hands, saying something to the effect, if I could just wash all this off. And Branch Rickey, from that point on, thought if I could ever make that change, anything, he said, someday maybe I could. And when he got into baseball, then is when he found Jackie Robinson. I had the chance to meet Branch Rickey one time. I was a 7th grader. I talked my way. He was back for homecoming at Ohio Wesleyan. I talked the usher. The usher said, you can't go down there. He's down at the front. It was halftime. He said, you can't go down there. And everybody else in his box had left for halftime, and he stayed there. He was an older man. And I said, but my grandfather was a trainer on his team, and I wanted to just say hi. And he said, I've turned my back. I didn't see you go by. And I walked on down, and Branch Rickey said to me, well, sit down. Yes, he remembered my grandfather, and he said, well, sit down here, let's talk. And I know he asked me how I was doing in school, and I'm sure I lied about that one. No, not but anyway, he had the bushiest eyebrows. I always remembered. Bushiest eyebrows I've ever seen on a person. But here we are in Powell baseball, and I see all this, and that uniform is unbelievable right there. Do they all know about that?
I don't know.
Sure, you better tell them.
And it used to have a P and an O, there's the W, used to have an E and an L and an L. Well, when Powell was done with it, somebody from Worthington got it. Put the W on, took the rest of it off.
How old is that?
I don't know, probably 1909.
1909, okay, around that, yes.
One of those.
There's one of those teams. You know, early games would go, they could go from the early morning to night when they were first playing. And they could get into the hundreds in runs scored. They would be an all-day event at those. And they would invite, again, people who were not on the team to actually participate. Some of the ball fields around, I believe that that's up at Kilburn. Yes. This one, I think those were over at Galena. That's the old community field in Delaware, the old stadium where the soccer field is there in Ohio Westland. What it is today. Now I think we are in Sudbury. Yes. This is down at Galena. Finally, in the early 1920s, they did go to football. They did play. They, for example, played a game, I believe it was Galena or perhaps Sudbury, that went up to Ashley to play. Ashley's field was behind the school, the football field was, down in low ground. And there wasn't a creek all that far away. And it was at a wet time. I mean, really wet. And the balls, of course, kept getting so muddy. They had one person from the school who went out into this mud pool with all this mud around it, and there was a pool of water out in the middle, and he went out there in that cold weather, took off his shoes and socks, waited out there for the whole game, because his job was they would keep throwing him a football to wash off. And then they would quickly and he was busy the whole game. The newspaper article about him said that he stuck with it the whole game, but they never got his name because they could never get close enough to him in the mud. But they thought he deserved a medal for that. But I think maybe this is that area. And there's one from Galena High School, building of the stadium in Ohio Westland. Selby Stadium, built in 1929. There's their original gym in Ohio Westland, the Fairbanks Gym. Never played basketball in there, but it was a gymnasium. And it looks more like a house. But it's, of course, no longer standing. It was donated by a man by the name of Charles Fairbanks, Vice President of the United States, attended Ohio Westland. He was from Indiana. He was from over in the other side of, actually eventually in Indiana, I believe. But anyway, he was from Union County and came over to Ohio Westland and became close with the school, was big into sports. Another person at the university who became big into sports was a guy by the name of Reverend Dr. Herbert Welch, became president of Ohio Westland. And in the early 1900s, he was big into sports and he wanted it expanded. And so he became friends then with Fairbanks, and Fairbanks invited him to Washington, D.C. And he went there, and this is when Teddy Roosevelt was the president and Fairbanks was his vice president. So he introduced him to Teddy Roosevelt. Teddy Roosevelt, the Rough Rider, that rough character who feared nothing. And in fact, they talked about his doctor, Teddy Roosevelt's doctor, saying, "You need to stop the mountain climbing. You have asthma. That's not good for you." But that didn't stop him. He kept going. As rough as he was, he thought football needed to have something done. He said, "There's people getting killed in this sport." He said, of course, people were not padded in any way, and they had the rule that you could even take a player and throw them over the line. And he said, if there are not changes made, that he may play a part in disbanding this sport. And instead, they formed a committee to make up changes. And with him having met Welch and through Fairbanks, he was one of the people appointed to a few universities, a handful of them, to set up a committee to talk about the changes. That committee developed into what we call the NCAA. That was how it all began. And then Ohio Wesleyan was represented in that first group. Basketball gyms all over town. We have a restaurant on Winter Street called Mi Cerritos, just down from where the theater is. That taller building on the left, it had a basketball gym up there. They were able to play in this building also on the corner just down from the Strand at one point. They played in this building called the Armory in Delaware, the National Guard Armory. How all this got started, too, is this. In 1906, they built the old Edwards Gym at Ohio Wesleyan. Being centrally located in Ohio, it was considered at the time the finest gym in the state of Ohio, as far as for any universities or colleges. Being centrally located, they built that gym, and in 1909 it was, or 1908 perhaps, when Delaware High School, they built the Armory, they were playing their games in there, and they decided that they would put together a tournament. They found 9 teams, and I think 7 of them were from Ohio, and 1 from Kentucky, and 1 from Michigan. And they had a 9-team tournament in there. And then the next year, they went and thought, now with them having Edwards Gym being built in 1906, let's work with Ohio Wesleyan to hold it there. And they worked with a man by the name of Lynn St. John. Lynn St. John was the athletic director at Ohio Wesleyan. And he invited them then to, let's expand this a little bit and let's hold it here at Ohio Wesleyan. And so the numbers began to grow in this, and grow year after year, until finally, after a number of years, Lynn St. John himself moved on to Ohio State. And the tournament, from the time that he went to Ohio State then sponsored the tournament, but sponsored it in Delaware at Ohio Wesleyan. It continued to grow. It got to 172 teams. People were being housed in people's homes, because it was still at a time when trying to go back home after a ball game just didn't work back then. That was just too far, so they would stay in town at dormitories, in people's homes. All what hotels they did have would fill up, and playing the games. they would have to play at all these other little places around town preliminary. It was the winning teams, in fact, I think had to play, the winning team, I think, had to play 5 games the same day in order to win that tournament there. And they finally, in 1922, I believe it was, they switched the basketball tournament. St. John said, "You've outgrown that community, we're taking it to Ohio State." And that's when it was officially the Ohio High School basketball championships were held there then. But that's how it all began. Just a view back when it stood, I don't know what that event was, but inside of that, of course, it didn't have the false ceiling there at that time, it would have been higher. You know, you talk about the home court advantages, and am I going too long? Are we still okay? Well, I need to get into some of these gyms and some of these early in the high schools and all the problems you had. For example, in the case of Radnor, I talked to a man many years ago who was on the first basketball team at Radnor. They played the game outside. They played it on the back of what is today the Heritage Society there in Radnor, right on the corner. They had 1 basket, a dirt court, and those were official games. You played with just 1 basket, and all the teams were playing outside. All of them were. There weren't any gyms. Now, schools had gyms back in the teens, in the early teens. They had their gyms in schools, but the problem was they weren't allowed to play basketball in them. Those were for phys ed classes. Remember how the old gyms were? You had an auditorium type seating on one side. You had the flat gymnasium floor, and then the stage on the other side of the floor. Powell was like that, wasn't it?
And a stage.
Yeah, they had the stage, and then you had the floor of a basketball court, right? Or of a court. And then I don't know if you had seating on the other side. That way, you didn't, okay. Well, but some of them did. I know Ostranders, Scioto Valley, they had theirs that way. Sudbury had it that way. Orange High School, the original Orange, had theirs that way. And so that was the problem. Now, here's a setting, though, with, for example, Orange High School. They had one of the big school fights. Actually, though, I should go back and mention a little bit earlier than that. I should mention the fact that, for example, when Radnor went to play Hyatt's, there was no transportation, so they took the streetcar from Radnor through Delaware down 23 to the corner of the road right there where you cut over to Hyatt's. I don't know that. I'm sorry?
It's Hyatt's Road.
Oh, Hyatt's Road, of course. Yeah, well, I should have. Yeah, it doesn't get much easier than that, does it? Yeah.
Shanahan on the other side.
Yeah, Shanahan's the other side, yeah. They took it to the corner of Hyatt's and 23, and then they had to walk on over to Powell, or to Hyatt's to play the game, and then walk back to get the streetcar back after the game. So transportation were problems. But here's the other problem, is that because they were all playing outside originally, they, in the case of Bell Point, I believe it was 1915, when Bell Point had the first indoor gym in the county for basketball, as far as away from the city of Delaware. So all your small schools, they thought, that's unfair. I mean, how can we how you're going to expect us and them to be allowed to do this because we have to play outside. So when they went to play Bell Point, they agreed, but only under the circumstance that we will play the first half inside. Second half, you're going to play at your outdoor court, because that's what we have to play on. And that was the rules that was set. Now, finally, you did get into, though, these indoor courts like Orange. Orange had that theater type of seating on one side where it went up, and then on the other side is the stage. It's okay for gym classes, but there were no baskets in that gymnasium. No idea to play basketball in there. Only for gym was that used. Well, finally there was a push that they wanted to play inside. And when they got to pushing for this, turned into a real school fight, because they had these lights that hung down, for one thing, but they were nice-looking lights. And the people thought, you're going to destroy the ambiance of this auditorium by saying you're going to raise the lights to the ceiling and put a little basket thing around it? And they said, no, you're not. And that went on for quite a while before they finally agreed to allow them to do it. And when they did allow them to do it, it was only to play their regular games, no practicing inside there. You had to do all your practices outside. They owned one ball. So every week, one of the players had to be assigned, because it was a dirt court. So if they're practicing all week outside, that ball could get pretty rough. And so you were assigned to, once a week, one of the players has to take the bucket of warm water and a scrub brush and scrub down the ball for the game. That was part of the thing. The other thing is this, home court advantages. I went way back to this armory. They had a home court advantage when you played in there. They had a beam that came across. Does anybody remember that? They had a beam that came across, and it was low enough that it would cause a problem in shots and shooting at one end of the court, only at the one end. And the home team, they practiced around that. I mean, they would learn to shoot over that beam. And they were pretty good at that. So they had that home court advantage for playing there. Places like Orange. Now, Orange, their basket on one end was flush against the wall and up against the ceiling to make it regulation height. The top of the backboard touched the ceiling. There was another gym where they actually had to cut off about 2 or 3 inches off the top of the backboard to squeeze it in. The other end, in one of the gyms, the other end, the ceiling was higher, but it sloped for some reason down to that. And now in the case of Orange, they had a basket attached to the wall, and out of bounds, well, out of bounds is always just when it hits the wall. And so when you take the ball in, when you're taking it in bounds, the rule was 1 foot has to be touching the wall. So that's how that worked. And as far as people sitting, they could sit, you sat on the stage and you sat up in the stands on the other side, but a lot of the people sat on the stage behind where the teams are sitting. And at one end, they had a wire coming down from the basket that was braced to it wasn't attached at one end to the wall. There was a wire running to the wall and another wire at the other side of the basket running to the stage. That was great for home court advantage, because the home team would shake the wire when the other team was shooting, and the basket would vibrate a little bit. Then you had other things. Now, like, for example, at Delaware, they had weak boards at the old Willis School that were close to the foul line, and they tried to get them to go that direction. The potbelly stove, one of the schools, was out on the court. And so you could practice around, that's your sixth man out there on the court, or sixth woman is driving by that hot stove right there. So there were all kind of different advantages. Radnor, they had a stage, but at the other end they didn't have any seating. In fact, they really didn't have any seating except up on the stage. But one guy, he found a way to get around that. Now this is inside of that historical society there at Radnor. Now it's a museum. But it was a place for performances, but also they turned it into a basketball room. And there wasn't hardly any seating. This one guy who was pretty tall, he found a way, because on one side there were windows looking out on the road. And he could pull off right there. So he got his horse and wagon, and he pulled his wagon right up beside there. And he's sort of tall, and by standing up the back of the wagon, or actually I think on the seat of the wagon, he could stand there, and with the windows raised up inside the room, he could lean against the windowsill and watch the game, which was great. I mean, he had the best view of the house, and except that was true until the horse decided to leave. And the horse did leave and left him hanging there, and they had to stop the game and pull him inside, and then the players went out and chased down the horse. But all kind of things in those early sports games. I'm going to go on quickly here and go quickly through this just to show you some of these. There's your old Edwards gym, and the gym was on the second floor. This is inside of that gym, and it had a balcony, and it also was where they had their track meets inside. And so to get into the bleachers, there was also a sloped walkway in behind, because that was for running your track meets. You needed a sloped to get your momentum. This was Benedetti, where they played that first women's basketball game back behind the building. This picture here, this is a great picture. And we picked the best of the three. This was, Brad, you took this picture. You took it over at Sunbury. By mistake, I know. But you took three of them, and I picked the best of the three. And it's simply looking down at the ground. But when I think of it, way back in sports history, in basketball, those players would have said, wow, look at that. That's fantastic. We ought to get ourselves some kind of a floor like that. There's the inside of the Radnor Historical Society with the stage at one end and the windows over here on the right. There's the side of the building where he pulled up the wagon. And here is, I am not sure if this is
Buckeye Valley.
Is that Buckeye Valley over west? Was that at Ostrander, in other words? Ostrander's was like this. That was, okay. Okay, well, Ostrander had one. They had a coach one time at Ostrander by the name of Thad Seeley. Then he went on to Buckeye Valley, became athletic director. But Thad was a lively little guy, and he also, everybody, the students really liked him. But boy, you better not want to mess with him. He was a slight little man, and he was a coach, and he could have a temper. And he got himself kicked out of the game at Ostrander in the game, and kicked out of the game, out of the gym, you know. And so he went down and stomped around a little bit down in the dressing room for a while, and then he decided, well, if I have to leave, so is everybody else. And he went and pulled out all the fuses and threw them in the furnace. And so everything went dark, and the game's over. Buckeye Valley East. This would be Sunbury at Big Walnut, I believe. The St. Mary's School in Delaware, it also had a gym and the stage at the end. That's in my basement. We had a gym above. How many here are familiar with the basketball gyms in the barns? There we go, you know. And when you think of hundreds of barns around this county back in the day, either on the inside or outside, there were basketball rims. And inside, my grandfather built one in our barn, and I took it down, and before we did, moved it to the house, we measured the height and the angle. And it was at an angle. And I asked my dad about that. He said, well, it's leaned against a beam. And he said, and that was so that if we didn't fall out of the oats bin up above where they had the flat floor, and so we put it back in the corner. And his rib was a barrel hoop, is what that is. Could fit 2 basketballs through there. But this gym here was one of my cousins had this over by Galena. And it was definitely the most active barn gym in the history of the county. It ended up to the point where they had they counted on one weekend, they had 95 young people play in there from 5 different school districts. And because back in the day, you could have the nice gyms, but you weren't allowed to play in there on the weekends. And they didn't open them up as much as they do now. And so this gym, they talked my cousin, talked their mother into, she wanted to put in a little rec room in her house with a new carpet. And they had the idea of turning the barn into a gym up above. And so they had a family meeting, and the vote was they had 4 boys and her dad and her husband and her. And so you know what the vote was? It was 5-1. Yeah. But she really did like sports. And it was her dad who turned it into it, really. To get into that gym on the 2nd floor, they had a ladder that went up. And you had to crawl through a hole to get into the gym. But once you got inside, it was like this cavernous, it was quite a place. They had taken up the wood, taken it over to Lewis Center, had it planed out so that they could put it on the floor, and then bought all this plywood to put down. They painted the lines and everything, and so it was, there were people playing in there 365 days a year. They'd even come in the afternoons on Christmas or on Thanksgiving. And they never charged anything. They put a little can outside their back door, and they did get donations occasionally, but they went through a lot of basketballs and a lot of ribs over the years. But Otterbein players also would come up to play there, and but it was quite a place. And this gym in Delaware I'll end with. This was the old Willis School gym. And Willis School, well, let's see here. This is up at Hayes, the old Hayes gym that had the sunken gym. And but going back to this Willis gym, it had a balcony. It was a little box. And anybody ever been in it? That gym? You've been in there? Well, I can tell you that it's just a little box. It seated officially 750 people. But at one time they had 1,400 people in there. That was before fire regulations. But they, and in a little square like that, the sound just echoed. And you just couldn't hear a thing. And I've had bus duty in that gym, and I know that when you get a lot of people making a lot of noise, that can be a very loud place. there's another angle. And one time we had a history of basketball for Delaware County. And we had representatives from all the schools, anybody that wanted to come, all the schools from all the old schools in the county, and referees and coaches, and then the public was able to come, and they ended up holding it to get a bigger space. They held it at the Hayes High School in the gym. And the master of ceremonies was a guy by the name of Bill Hoskett, who used to play for Ohio State, and he ran a This Is Your Life on the history of basketball in Delaware County. He had a script, and then they would come out and be introduced. And we only invited one person from out of the county. That person's name was Ed Counts. He played for Urbana, the Urbana Hilltoppers. And they were ranked number 1 back in the day. And we asked their player to come. They had beaten Delaware over in Urbana 81-18. And the next game, they had to play in Delaware. And you're talking home court advantages. And they came into that gym, and they said, even at timeouts, you could not hear a single word that the coach said. It was just vibrating the entire game. And they said they really had us shook. We did beat Delaware in overtime by a point. But he said it was the loudest. And when he came over for this event, he said, I will come back to Delaware. He said, but you're holding it at the new high school. And he said, I'll come if I can go in there one more time. I want to see that. He said he played in the state championship in St. John Arena. St. John Arena at Ohio State is a lot louder than the Shot, if you've ever been in there. And just because of the way it's built. And he said, and yet, he said the loudest game he ever remembered, even after playing in St. John, was in this little place because of it just vibrating off the walls. And he said, when the game was over, I went down into the dressing room, and our star, Gail Evans, is sitting there on the bench, and he's crying. And he said to me, if there is a hell, we were just in it. And that's how we end with the lights out at the Willis Gym. And thank you all. I'd be glad to answer a question. Yes?
The hanging in the basketball games in Mansfield, were they hanging the referees?
Well, maybe, I don't know, but I can tell you this. Hyatt's had a game down here at Powell one time. And the referee was from Hyatt's. Powell won. And the Hyatt's people were irate. They thought that their referee had caused it. And he was from Hyatt's. And he missed his ride back to Hyatt's. And so he was walking and trying to get a ride, and people were traveling in horses and wagons to get there. Nobody picked him up. He walked all the way home. But, they would have hugged him probably if they could. Well, you've been a very patient audience. Thank you.